Well, welcome back to Michael Horner's discussion here on influential myths. And in previous episodes, we've been discussing this particular urban myth that Christianity has been a net negative influence in the history of humanity, that we'd all be better off if it had never occurred. There are blemishes that Christianity has on its record, like we've talked about the Crusades and the Inquisition and so forth. But when we actually look at what the scholarship has to say on this, contrary to what, say, people like Christopher Hitchens might write, but when we actually look at what the scholarship and the academic research shows, it reveals that the net benefits of Christianity far outweigh the negative things that have been done in the name of Christianity in the past. Now, the question is, can we enjoy those net benefits, those benefits of Christianity, or the benefits of the teachings of Jesus Christ, without having to actually embrace the teachings of Jesus Christ, which is the core of authentic Christianity? So that's today's discussion. And Michael, why don't you start us in this discussion?
Sure. Both you and I know Kirk, since we've done, the two of us, probably well over 100 debates on university campuses, mostly against atheists, that, for me anyways, the most common theme that repeated itself over and over from the mouths of every atheist that we debated, that I debated, was this idea that you don't need God to be good. And whatever you do, you Christian, don't accuse atheists of being bad. We can know good and evil, right and wrong, just as much as you can. And in fact, atheists are probably even better at it than you are. Like there was an insecurity there, I think, underneath it, but also they wanted to make a strong case. Atheists aren't bad people. We not only know good and evil just as much as anyone else, we can do good. And this ties into the stage we're at in our analysis here of the thinking that took over our culture in the Enlightenment period. So roughly 250, 300 years ago, the Enlightenment began to be dominant. And up to that point, we've made the case in previous episodes that despite Christians being far from perfect, the teachings of Jesus and the New Testament have been the source of the most positively transformational contributions to human flourishing that have occurred in human history. And many unbelievers are recognizing this, in these current days, and they're speaking out about it publicly. For example, the humanist historian Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, which we've referred to many times, the psychologist Jordan Peterson, who does not seem to be a Christian yet, but is speaking out about many of the benefits that come from Christianity. The secular journalist Douglas Murray, the same thing. The humanist historian Niall Ferguson, the politician and former Muslim and former atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and even everyone's favorite outspoken biologist and atheist Richard Dawkins. He just called himself a cultural Christian a few weeks ago. But by doing so, they are affirming the fruit of Christianity and that it's good for human flourishing. But they can also see the fruit is disappearing, maybe, or it's being twisted into something almost unrecognizable. And so they're acknowledging that they want the fruit of Christianity, even if they're still not so sure. They want the root. What I mean by the root is the supernatural grounding that produces the fruit. Niall Ferguson said in an interview with Jordan Peterson, he says, "I'm a lapsed atheist, Jordan. I go to church every Sunday precisely because, having been brought up an atheist, I came to realize in my career as an historian, not only that atheism is a disastrous basis for a society, and Parenthetically, he adds, atheist societies have probably committed more violations of human rights than any others, which fits with our previous episodes.
Yeah.
And then he continues and says, but also because I don't believe it can be a basis for individual ethical decision making. And that quote really captures what we're going to try to deal with here. If Western culture is truly indebted to Christianity for its most significant values, and that's what our earliest episodes made the case for, then how did so many Christian values get twisted into the values, beliefs, and practices that we're seeing right now that are arguably counter to Christianity? And I claim that there are at least two broad forces at play here, and probably more. Secular humanism, or the Enlightenment humanism, and this new kid on the block, for lack of a better term, it kind of comes out of cultural Marxism and postmodernism, and has kind of been labeled wokeness lately. But both of them, secular humanism and wokeness, are based on the same presupposition that goes back to what I'm calling Enlightenment humanism, which is just the origin of secular humanism, that the good values of Western civilization do not require God in order to exist, and do not require belief in God for people and cultures to believe and practice them. Now, there's a kernel of truth in that belief. The history of our Western civilization actually partially confirms that, because the Enlightenment was a mix of people, whether they realized it or not, adopting values that came out of Christianity, but many of them were not Christians or even not theists, and were actually committed to pushing out the supernatural. And that in that time period has produced positive benefits for Western civilization. And out of that came many of the good features of Western culture that people point to, and that cause people to want to move to Western cultures, Western democratic cultures, from all over the world. But people are seeing that everything wasn't perfect from the beginning, and now as time goes on, those benefits look like they might only be temporary. The fruit seems to maybe not be lasting. So that's what we're going to look at, what I call fruit without the root, which is the core belief, I think, of Enlightenment humanism. And I think it is the myth of Enlightenment humanism, sort of the next sort of sub myth that we're looking at. We've seen the myth of religious violence. Well, this is the myth of Enlightenment humanism. So Enlightenment humanism contained the idea that the good principles of Christian morality, especially now the concepts of equal value, worth, and dignity of every human being, and then the individual human rights and freedoms that flow from that, and religious tolerance that comes from that, could all be believed, applied, and developed even further without believing in the biblical, historical, metaphysical, and theological foundations for them. That is the view of Enlightenment humanism that I'm going to challenge as being a myth. So, examples here. People wanted equal value for human beings, but they wanted to reject that God made them in his image. Why? Well, because there either is no God, or if there was, for the deists, he was only a distant and uncaring God. Yet they wanted to maintain this idea that human beings are valuable and have inherent dignity. The Enlightenment thinkers wanted to cherish reason and science, but at the same time reject the intelligent designer slash creator who made an intelligible universe and values reason and created humans with intellects and the ability to reason. In fact, they actually contrasted revelation with reason rather than seeing the two as consistent. When you read Enlightenment thinkers, whenever reason is brought up, it's always put in contrast to revelation, which is untrustworthy, and reason, which is trustworthy. Third example is they also contrasted reason with faith, not recognizing that the Christian scriptures' understanding of faith was trusting in something you have good reasons to believe. It wasn't the idea of blind faith or believing contrary to the evidence or anything like that. That was
Yeah, I've often heard that.
they were imposing that upon
Yeah.
Christianity. So I have an illustration that, at least out of my life, that fits with this. In addition to the type of material we talk about here, I have another interest and an area that I have some expertise in, and that's basketball. It's you people can't tell, but I'm only 5'8", but I used to play a lot taller, and I did play university basketball. Yeah, it was in Canada, so okay, I know. Um, but I really got into the sport. I loved it, and I played it right up until my knees wouldn't let me anymore at age 63. But I also coached it. I coached it for many decades, and I've coached with many other coaches, and I've observed many other coaches. And what I've seen is that I think the Enlightenment thinkers thought, like many other coaches did, that all the things that they emphasized were necessary for the success that they experienced. Everything that they believed was critical to that success and necessary. Whereas my view is not necessarily everything you believe was necessary to explain some of the success. So with basketball coaches, I've observed many of them thought that every element of their coaching philosophy and style was necessary for the successful results they achieved. And if you just took one of those things out, it's not going to work. But my observation was, no, there's probably only one or two things you did that really led to your success, and a lot of the other things, yeah, you could have had them or not had them. They may or may not have helped. And so I think with the Enlightenment humanists, something like anti-supernaturalism was not necessary, which I think they thought it was. They thought they had to be completely anti-supernatural, against the existence of God, against the existence of miracles. But you don't need anti-supernaturalism in order to believe in the equal value, worth, and dignity of every human being. So, and we've pointed out before that certainly the scientists were mostly theists. It was the non-scientists among the Enlightenment thinkers that pushed the atheism side of things. So, Enlightenment humanism, then, and especially when it kind of got connected to a liberal theological thinking and practice, it progressively emphasized more of the fruit of Christianity. That is, the good things, the good values that they were happy to adopt, and they emphasized less emphasis on the root, that is, the supernatural teachings that are part of Christianity. That is, they emphasized the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament that promoted social equality and justice, but they de-emphasized and even campaigned against the root, that is, the spiritual and supernatural part of the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament, which is what will ultimately produce the fruit that lasts. And this was partly motivated by the beliefs, and these are beliefs that I've been calling myths in this series, like the myth of the Dark Ages, and like the myth of religious violence, and the myth of an inherent conflict between science and Christianity, which all contributed to people gradually being persuaded that Christianity was harmful, and you need to get rid of the harmful elements, which are the supernatural. So why am I talking about this? Why is the root so important? Why is the root needed? Remember, the atheists in our debate said, you don't need God to be good. Well, there's two ways, and that phrase can be taken. One is you don't need God as a foundation for morality, or you don't need God in order to actually be good and do the good. Well, without any foundation in a good God as the moral lawgiver, the moral values become just arbitrary matters of opinion. It becomes a matter of opinion that human beings have inherent value, worth, and dignity, and they have human rights. But if there's no good God as the moral lawgiver, people start doubting the objectivity. They begin to wonder if these things are just arbitrary. And once you begin doing that, then you're how much you feel you're obligated to follow them, how much of a duty you have to follow these things, is undermined as well. So that the justification of the ethical duties is undermined, as well as accountability to God for keeping them. So if you get rid of the foundation, you're going to have a problem with the justification of the duties and accountability to God for keeping them. And that's going to have an effect on people actually keeping them on a regular basis. Now, you and I both debated a professor from the University of Toronto who will remain nameless here. He was my professor in a meta-ethics course in philosophy at the University of Toronto in the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s. And I was writing a paper and making the claim in class that if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. And we were disagreeing about that. And one day he came to me and thought he had the knockdown argument against me. He says, look, I know that objective moral values exist. And so that's all you need to ground their objectivity. Because if I know it, then it must be a justified true belief.
That's a tough one. I mean,
Yeah,
I did discuss this with him as well,
yeah,
this professor who shall remain nameless. And when I talked with him, he seemed to believe in some sort of Platonic moral reality out there, that there are these objective moral beliefs that are, at the time, seemed to me not controlled by the laws of nature and anything like that. And my response is, aren't you getting dangerously close to admitting the realm in which God exists? Aren't you getting awful close? You're just taking the moral values without the foundation for those things, or the explanation as where they come from. But there's another problem here. I don't know if you're going to develop this or not, but a lot of people think they know things. I mean, they're absolutely convinced they know such and such. And but being convinced you know something, that may motivate you for a while until you actually start to think about it and ask, well, why do I know this? Do I actually know these things? How would I verify these things? What grounds would I have for thinking that what I know is actually true? If you take the correspondence theory of truth, like your beliefs are true if and only if they correspond to moral reality. But is there a moral reality out there? And just saying I know that there is ends up to be kind of circular. So, yeah, I don't know. What would you say about that, Michael?
Well, there was something to his argument, because at that point I had become convinced that I knew that torturing babies for sport was objectively wrong. Now, how did I know that? I just knew that through direct intuition. And so I began to study the concept of intuition from a philosophical perspective, and realize that that's how morality works. That's how anybody knows that certain that moral principles are real, and that certain ones are right, and certain other ones are wrong. They're violations of moral principles. And academic philosophers admit this. It ends up coming down to a duel between different intuitions sometimes, but we find ourselves as human beings sharing way more intuitions about morality than we differ on. So I kind of wanted to acknowledge that uh, he had touched on something correct when he says he knows objective moral values exist. But that doesn't mean he actually has a justification that explains that he knows it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, he needed to separate the epistemological issue, that is, that we know something and how we know it. And in this case, I was admitting it was through intuition.
Mm-hmm.
But that's different than the ontological issue, which is the actual existence of objective moral values. How could they exist, and how could I know them if
Yeah.
they did not, if they weren't based in a good God lawgiver? So separating those two categories was the critical part for me.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Michael. That it from a Christian perspective, the Bible states that somehow this law, it calls it, this moral law is within us. It's our God-given moral intuition. So
It's written on our hearts, the Apostle
yes,
Paul said.
so we would know in a foundational sense of knowledge, some sort of we just know something is wrong. The question is, what is the explanation? What's the justification for this?
Right, exactly. So, since all human beings are flawed and regularly fail to do even what we know we ought to do, ignoring the root for values undermines the belief and trust in Christianity, which provides inner resources to help people do what they ought to do. It undermines the grace and the spiritual growth that leads to the development of virtue, as well as the strength to do what is right, especially when we don't want to. So this takes us to the phrase, the fruit without the root. How can the Enlightenment atheists accept values that, whether they knew it at the time or not, are actually values rooted in Christianity? How can they accept the fruit without the root? I mean, you've given me the example that you've seen a branch broken off of a tree, completely severed from the tree and the root of the tree, and yet something grew. It began to grow a little bit, some buds, but it didn't get very far, right?
Well, it actually, uh, I was an aspen that I cut down the middle of in the dead of winter when there was no leaves on it at all. And then I trimmed those branches off and I threw them into the pile. Come springtime, those branches budded and leafed out, although the leaves weren't quite as large as normal. And what's happening here? Is this a miracle or what? And it's no miracle. It's just that the nutrients were still in the branch that had gotten from the main trunk and the roots, of course. But once those nutrients were used up around July, those leaves started to wither up, and by the end of August, those branches were dead. But you see, there wasn't an instantaneous loss of show of life the moment it was severed from the trunk. And that's kind of what fits in with the way you
Oh,
started off.
exactly.
It's
This is
like
a perfect illustration.
it's not an instantaneous change. It's like a ship that has come unmoored from its anchor. It's not suddenly find itself somewhere else, but it does begin to drift. And same with the branch. It doesn't have any more nutrients. There's not a replenishment of the nutrients to the branch, and slowly it starts withering and eventually it dies. And I think, as you explained, that's exactly what we're seeing now in our civilization once it sort of cuts itself off from God.
Right. So the Enlightenment humanism's approach of trying to have the fruit without the root in the long run is not going to work. Although temporarily there seemed to be some growth there. In fact, enough that Western culture actually, surpassed other cultures as having some good, really good features. So the last 300 years has been a mix of functioning as though the Christian values are true and even self-evident, as the American founders put in the Declaration of Independence, and at the same time pushing back against the moorings and the foundations of these values. But the truth is, apart from the root, the fruit will not remain. It won't last. And so Nietzsche made this point explicit in the 19th century, 1882, that when the foundation or the roots for the so-called Enlightenment values was removed, that the fruit would not remain for long. That when God is removed from the picture, that the fruit, the Christian values, would soon disappear too. So with Nietzsche, if God is dead, then the foundations for the values are gone. And he challenged these Enlightenment humanists, the liberals, the humanists, the Marxists, to admit this. His words ended up being a prophecy of the horrors of social Darwinism, eugenics, racism, communism, fascism, Nazism, and two world wars, which saw the direction humanity took once the foundations of the Christian values were effectively removed in people's minds. Didn't take too long for the slide to happen. So you need to understand, Nietzsche was not a Christian. Nietzsche hated Christian morality. He called it a slave morality. He was not positive to Christian values at all. And Enlightenment humanists and subsequent advocates for secular humanism, according to John Stonestreet and Maria Baer of the Colson Institute, they have always resembled the cynical onlookers portrayed by Friedrich Nietzsche in his parable of the madman. That's how Nietzsche communicated this truth, that if you remove God, the values are going to go soon. This madman is in the town square, and the madman declares, "I seek God, I seek God." And the onlookers mock him. Has God gotten lost like a child? They ask. Has he gone on a voyage? Now, after all, this was the end of the 19th century. Who believed in God anymore? And Stonestreet and Baer continue. They say, what the mockers missed, Nietzsche's parable taught, is that even as the secular intellectuals of the day mocked belief in God, they were holding on for dear life to the fruits of the faith they disdained. In fact, they seemed blissfully unaware of what untethering the world from God would entail, both for individuals and for society. No longer could social norms like human rights, scientific progress, or the preference of kindness over cruelty be justified, much less maintained in practice. After all, only a belief in a particular type of creator could ground such notions. What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Asked Nietzsche. So many scholars think that it was exactly the pious, the free thinker, Enlightenment atheist humanist that Nietzsche was mocking in this parable. Those that think there are no implications to eliminating God and are blind to those implications already in their midst.
Do you think that's what Richard Dawkins is seeing now? Is he starting to get nervous?
Yes, exactly. That's what many unbelievers are starting to see. And yeah, they're becoming nervous about it. Exactly right. So, as I said, we have seen significant but only temporary cultural growth from the influence of Christianity. And it certainly has been far from perfect. And we've looked at both the good and the positive that has come from Christianity. Yet it has been the best thing that's ever happened to the world, according to many historians these days, as the historical evidence shows, and as many people who are not Christians are beginning to recognize. And it's why millions of people have been trying to move to Western democratic nations for over a century or two. So now is not the time to throw it all out and start over. We need to retain what we can of the fruit that Christianity has brought and the root that nourishes it. Yes, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Um, she was in a little discussion with Oz Guinness, and Oz Guinness made the point that I'm making, that without the fruit, the root is not going to last. And she tried to provide a more hopeful analogy here. And we need to realize the fruit without the root is just an analogy. It doesn't prove anything. It's just illustrating a point that we think is true, that if you get rid of the um, root teachings of Christianity, that the fruit values of Christianity aren't going to last very long. So she put forward another metaphor. Well, sure, you've cut down the root, but why don't we just plant the seeds again? So she was trying to give an optimistic tone to uh, Guinness's correct analysis that without the root, you're not going to get the fruit. But I think she's right. We need to replant the seeds of Christianity and have those roots grow again, and the fruit will grow again. In other words, we've seen what the good values that come from Christianity. After 2,000 years, it was slower than we wanted, but it's real. But we've only seen a small amount of what it could be. And instead of our world trying to throw it all away now and saying, oh, it doesn't work, or we know that there's no God, so you have to just can't hold on to this wishful thinking anymore. No, we need to double down on the Christian fruit and the root, and we'll see what really could happen. So that's my advice for the unbeliever here. We need to revisit the roots for the sake of our culture and for our own individual sakes as well. Regardless of how we got here, modern society has recognized that human beings have equal value, worth, and dignity. I think that's one of those intuitions that we feel strongly about now, right? And we also recognize how important that truth is. Given that, it also makes sense to ask which worldview can make sense of this truth the best. And it also makes sense to revisit the reasoning from recent centuries that concluded Christianity is not only not necessary to ground these fundamental values, but it's actually the enemy of these values. See, since you accept the values, you should also accept the worldview, that is the other beliefs that are consistent with the values, and or can make sense of them, and or provide a reasonable foundation for them. The Enlightenment style atheist needs to revisit things like the things you and I talk about: the existence of God, the possibility of miracles. That is the idea that science has disproved miracles, or that Hume's argument has shown miracles to be more improbable than anything else, etc., etc. Because the existence of God and the life of Jesus as the incarnation of God are the roots, the foundation upon which the Christian values are based, and Enlightenment atheists need to revisit these roots. The foundation for the values is built upon solid, reasonable, rational grounds. It's not wishful thinking. There are good reasons to believe that the fundamental truths of Christianity are, in fact, true. And Enlightenment atheists are epistemologically obligated to revisit the support for these foundational Christian claims, since their attempts to provide a convincing ground for the values, apart from Christian theism, have failed. And a robust contemporary positive case for Christianity exists, as well as robust responses to objections to Christian theism. And this revisiting should be done not just with an open mind, but also with an openness to the applicability of these foundational claims of Christianity to culture and the individual. So, I mean, that's a strong statement. I think the evidence is there for the non-theist, the non-Christian, to revisit this fruit without the root myth that worked for kind of a little while, but we're not quite sure how long. Well, we're beginning to see it's just not working.
Yeah, I think we are seeing that with the even the mental health of the population. I think is an indicator. that something has gone off course with our society, and that will affect us as individuals, our feelings of well-being, sense of well-being. It'll affect the work ethic and everything that we do. That's just one indication, not to mention a lot of other things we read about in the news on a daily basis. When I was young, nobody in my area even bothered, at least very few, if any, bothered to lock their doors. And they might be away for a day, for a week, because the Judeo-Christian ethic was very strong. Now it would be foolish to not lock your doors. So what has changed? Is our society, what is the society going in a positive direction when that happens, or negative? And what has brought about that change? And I think what you're saying here, Michael, really does underscore that there are maybe the short-term differences don't seem that great between atheism and theism when it comes to the fruit. But definitely we start noticing in the medium term and the long term is a disaster. And we can see that from history and other areas such as the work of J.D. Unwin.
Right. I'm actually going to decide to leave the rest of what I'd planned here for the next episode, except to just make one more comment here, because what I just finished saying is kind of a pushback against one of the other things that was repeated in virtually every debate that I engaged in with an atheist. And almost every atheist that I see and read online, the phrase, there is absolutely no evidence for the existence of God. There are no good arguments for God. I mean, that's just repeated over and over again. And I look at that and say, you've got to be kidding. I mean, in the last 40 years, Christians have upped their game. I mean, tremendously. And I just don't think that that can be said with intellectual integrity anymore. And so I really challenge atheists to admit there are robust, good arguments. There's good dialogue going on, and we should have good dialogue, but just to say that statement and to think that that ends the conversation just lacks integrity. There are good arguments for God's existence. Whether or not they're enough to persuade you, that's a totally different question. But to say there are no good arguments for God's existence, or there's no good evidence for the existence of God, I just don't think has intellectual integrity anymore. So I lay out that challenge to atheists. Please check out the best that Christian theists have to offer these days. The arguments are good, they're robust, they've got good responses to the objections, because there are thoughtful objections, of course. But I think in the end, this is all important for the issue of the fruit without the root. The more people can realize that we shouldn't throw God out completely, the more likely we are to be able to retain more of the fruit, more of the good things that we've just begun to see in Western culture, and still have a long way to go. So let me finish.
Yeah, I totally agree, Michael. I'm just appalled or agog when a person does make such an assertion. It's like a form of denialism. And we have people who deny all sorts of things. So people will be, for example, Holocaust deniers, or deny that the earth is round. But I think to make an assertion like that, and I say this hopefully with some charity, it reflects, I think, a lack of rational thinking, like good, solid rational thinking on the topic, and perhaps an ignorance of the evidence that is out there, discussed by philosophers. And we're not just talking Christian philosophers, but in philosophy departments in universities around the world. Whether they believe it or not, whether it's compelling or not, that's a different question. But to assert simply that there is no evidence for the existence of God is just wow. Like, that's amazing. That's awesome that somebody would actually say that in public.
Yeah. So next episode, we're going to look more at these values and begin to ask, how did the removing the root, how does that affect some of the values? And I'll say up front here, there is a lot more work that I think needs to be done on this. I think many of our listeners could go far beyond what I've been able to do here, and maybe point out how they see a certain fruit that had its root in Christianity, but when a certain other root of Christianity kind of gets disbelieved or kind of gets cut, then it affects this fruit. It changes it, twists it, or changes it, or removes it completely. And I'm going to give some examples of that. And but I think there's probably many more, and I suspect people could go far beyond what I've done. But we will look at that and maybe move on to how should we proceed in the future with this, with trying to produce this type of fruit again. If we're not going to do it by the fruit without the root approach, how do you do it without imposing Christianity on culture, which is not something I want to do. I don't want to impose it. And so that there's some difficult questions there. But we'll leave that for the next session, or maybe even 2 more sessions. We'll see how it breaks down.
Sure. Well, thanks, Michael. This has, again, been fascinating, and you've raised some very interesting points for us to think about. So it's much appreciated.
Thanks, Kirk.